The defining trait of As Dusk Falls is in how it tells an original, unlicensed, and mature story using Telltale's trademarked choose-your-own-adventure structure. The allure of these games have always been the tough choices, the moments when your morals are questioned, when sides must be drawn, where risk and reward wreaks havoc on your mind and nerves. This newest title from developer Interior Night looks to heighten these choices through elevating the consequences and the stakes. In doing so, the game touches on many grim but all too real subjects that most video games tend to avoid, such as trauma, PTSD, hostage situations, murder, suicide, domestic abuse, and more. For these reasons, the game offers up a trigger warning at the outset, and before some chapters, so that players can be aware of what they're getting themselves into. And it's something you should be aware of too before watching this video. And I'll double up here by also making this a spoiler warning for As Dusk Falls. I am assuming a level of viewer familiarity with this game, as I won't be rehashing the events of the plot point by point, but I am going to spoil the game, so you've been warned. Regardless, delving into these dark themes allows for a different sort of escapism. Games normally provide us fantastical worlds, magical abilities, or mindless fun to distract ourselves from the stressors of real life, whether they be daily occurrences or tragic events, or sadly both. Sure, violence is often used as a form of interaction within video games, but rarely does that violence mirror that of our real world, and when it does, it's usually contextualized in a way that doesn't demonize the player for doing so using good guy versus bad guy tactics. In other words, player violence is often justified in games whether it's done by killing non-human enemies or presenting those human enemies as morally corrupt. As Dusk Falls, on the other hand, looks to provide escapism by allowing the player to put themselves into a real-life horror situation and make choices within that scenario without any real-world consequences. Regardless of what you choose or what happens, the only ripple effect takes place in the game world. In this way, it provides a fantastic tool to see how we would react in scenarios dealing with these dismal themes, while also allowing for the alleviation of guilt simply through turning the console off. You're permitted to take some steps into this dark and twisted scenario, and then return to the mundanity of your everyday life at the game's conclusion. So let's take a look at how this all plays out in the game. As Dusk Falls tells the story of a few different families and how one traumatic night changed the trajectory of their lives forever. You'll play as 5 different characters throughout the course of the story, but you'll start by controlling a middle-aged father named Vince. He's taking his wife Michelle, his 6-year-old daughter Zoe, and his father Jim, who has just recently come back into his life after a 30-year absence, on a trip across the country. The family is traveling east through Arizona, looking to reach St. Louis, where they'll start a new life together after some falling outs in their past. A car crash sees their journey come to a screeching halt as they choose to stay overnight at the Desert Dream Motel, awaiting repairs the next morning. Meanwhile, 3 brothers, oldest Tyler, middle Dale, and youngest Jay, were on the other end of that vehicle incident, but they keep moving forward to their objective, robbing the police sheriff of all his money. The burglary goes wrong, and the 3 boys end up crashing the scene at the Desert Dream Motel, and they create a hostage situation using Vince and his family, as well as motel owner Joyce and her helper Paul. Over the remainder of Chapter 1 and the next 2 chapters, the player will have to make tough choices to best navigate this hostage situation from Vince's perspective. At the same time, the player is given more backstory about the struggles of his marriage, as well as on Jay's situation, the youngest burglar, who seems like he's been caught up in all of this by happenstance. You'll also get hints and whiffs about the police sheriff's corruption, which makes you question if you can even trust him. Depending on your choices, you'll either align with the Holt family, whom is the ones you're currently being held hostage by, or you'll side with the police. In the process, a few characters can be killed if you choose poorly. And that probably sounds like the biggest exclamation points of this story, the moments of death. But while that's true, what is more thought-provoking here is the blurring of lines between good and evil. As Dusk Falls consistently pivots character motivations and backgrounds to show you that people aren't just black and white. Sometimes bad choices are motivated by good intentions, and sometimes those who represent justice aren't always so just themselves. At the same time, these morally gray characters are still participating in something as deadly as a hostage situation, so navigating the relationships and the motivations is heightened to a whole new level, putting a lot of pressure on the choices that you make. The characters are provided depth while not sacrificing the player's ability to choose for them based on their interpretations of each. And in some ways, those choices say more about you than they do the characters. For example, in one flashback, the marriage troubles between Vince and Michelle are explored. There's hints that the wife has not been faithful, and you're given the option to go down a path of forgiveness or of accusation. Depending on your own experiences with infidelity, you may make choices that might not necessarily align with what you think the character would do. If this occurs, As Dusk Falls provides a great way to reflect on your own tightly held beliefs on such a hurtful component of life. And this is just one of many scenarios you're permitted to engage with, and then reflect on as you continue to play. You'll also be confronted with choices about who in your family to save, how would you deal with coercion, how to react in coming face to face with a suicide attempt, and much, much more. Again, it's very heavy. Intrigued players will also naturally begin to ponder how our perspectives of people may influence our decision making in those tough moments. And that's a good mental exercise to engage with, challenging our own choices and being aware of our own biases. Over the first 3 chapters, you'll engage with many of these themes and make many of these hard selections. And in the end, you'll have to live with the consequences for as long as the game stays on. Again, you can walk away from these dark themes at any time by turning the console off if it proves to be too much. As the 3rd chapter wraps up, the hostage situation itself will be concluded for the most part. But the brilliant part of As Dusk Falls is that chapters 4 through 6 focus on the fallout of that carnage and the choices you made. The first half of the title explores the horrors of dangerous situations, while the second half explores the lingering consequences of these events, particularly the trauma it causes. This includes characters reacting to the death of loved ones, or the failure to process and cope with the mental toll the night took sheerly through being a part of it. Vince's story is mostly concluded about halfway through chapter 4, so instead, the story pivots to following the Holt family, including Mother Sharon, but in particular, it focuses on the youngest son, Jay. There's also time spent playing as Ash, the son of Joyce the motel owner, Paul, Joyce's aide, and future sequences involving the young adult version of Zoe. In Jay's arc, a fugitive story is told, as the player must discern for themselves if Jay's involvement warrants arrest or freedom. The character's dialogue will drive you towards the latter, but some endings will lead to his incarceration. The journey to that point is important though, as the player must make tough choices and decisions regarding drug consumption, the fallout of family, young love, and interacting with the police. Jay is perhaps the most tortured character in the game, undeservedly so, and navigating his legally wrongdoing actions versus his upstanding moral character is further evidence of the blurring of black and white the game utilizes. It's another example of the complexity of humanity, not only in an individual's behavior, but also how we as individuals view others through different lenses. The sections playing as Ash and Paul are less impactful, as they center more around steering non-playable characters towards their story conclusion. Ash's choices factor into Tyler's fate, while Paul's will influence what happens to Sharon and Dante. These bits are more about testing your perception of Tyler, Sharon, and Dante, who is the police sheriff if I didn't mention that earlier, after seeing their behaviors and motivations not only during the hostage crisis, but also in the bits of backstory you experienced. Meanwhile, other character endings like Paul and Ash themselves, or Grandfather Jim, are sometimes not explained, or they have concrete endings that can't be influenced by player choices. And again, that's a big reason for why some of these aren't as impactful. The game concludes though with a heavy sequel baiting sequence, so it wouldn't be shocking to see these plot lines wrapped up or explored further in another game, or perhaps DLC. For many players, the exploration of Zoe's trauma will be the most enduring takeaway from As Dusk Falls. During the hostage crisis, she is merely a 6-year-old girl, bearing witness to a series of terrible events, including her own internal fear of the dark, as well as violence and death. The game flashes forward 14 years in her sections, where the now 20-year-old college student struggles to control her anxiety and PTSD surrounding the events at the motel. Most of this has been triggered recently by Jay reaching out to her in written letters, seemingly an attempt to deal with his own guilt and pain. We live through a very realistic night, experiencing the haunting hallucinations, anxious dreams, and panic attacks that Zoe lives with on the daily. The toll it takes on her day-to-day life is undeniable, as she contemplates dropping out of college due to her own mental health issues. She can only find comfort in her obsession with holding her breath underwater for as long as possible. Only in the deep end of a pool can she find temporary relief in the darkening seconds before the mind slips into unconsciousness from lack of oxygen. She pushes herself to these extremes in hopes that it'll take away her memories of that night, but to no avail. For me personally, these scenes were the most impactful across the game, as it did a fantastic but unsettling job in portraying the effects of trauma on an individual, especially that of a child. The resolution to many of the characters' stories were satisfying and felt reflective of the choices I had made throughout the game. In my initial playthrough, only 2 characters were killed, middle son Dale and motel owner Joyce. However, we don't spend time playing as these characters, and the fallout of their deaths aren't explored in great detail, so it didn't leave any lingering emotion, which was sort of underwhelming considering the magnitude of death. Still, the characters who are invested in most, such as Vince, Michelle, Zoe, and Jay, all lived in my playthrough, and they found ways to deal with their issues, and that's mostly because of how I steered them. In this way, I felt my choices to be meaningful throughout the game, and that's what really matters most in a game of this nature, maintaining that illusion that your choices have consequences. And yes, I do mean that word, illusion. Ultimately, these games do have moments where your choices matter, particularly in if characters live or die. However, the game is still scripted. Certain events must take place, meaning you're shaping the story more than you are creating it. There's a general structure to the story, and it's the details that you can influence more than anything else. On a first playthrough, this works very well, because without knowing where the story will go, it's impossible to discern between what you control and what you don't. Because the player is constantly getting to have a say in how things go down, it's easy for our brains to slip into a belief that we are controlling every moment and every event and every outcome that transpires, even when that's not true. That's why I only recommend playing through this game once, because on subsequent runs, that illusion is shattered, especially when you see how little impact some of your choices actually have. Playing through the story a second time, making the opposite choices, told a relatively similar story overall, with lots of repeated dialogue, and making sure important plot points were always touched on as to not compromise the overall structure of the narrative. There's plenty of small examples of this, such as choosing to run or stay hidden when the police shootout starts. Doesn't matter what you choose, you're gonna be trapped. The biggest example to me, though, came in Dale's fate. Dale is slated to die no matter what you do. The only choice you have is when it happens, either to the hands of a sniper or in the crossfire of a shootout later. The death is meant to be a driving factor on what sends the Holt family down the dark descent. It makes their situation horrifyingly real and informs the rash decision-making they conduct in chapters 4 and 5. In other words, it's important for the narrative that Dale perishes, and so he will, no matter what you do. Meanwhile, other characters can't die, no matter what you have them say or what you have them do. And it's in this second playthrough where you start to see the constraints of the narrative. There's still an overall story being told, your decisions affect the details, but not the structure. You may be thinking, so what? This is how these sorts of games have worked for over a decade now. It's just how they are. And yeah, that's true. It's not a complaint unique to As Dusk Falls, but it is indicative of a genre that's starting to feel stale. The technology we're working with has come so far, and it feels like it's time for an evolution of this genre, one where players' choices can send the narrative in a plethora of different directions. This would give more meaning to the decisions while also making sure each player's playthrough is different not only in the details, but also in the overall flow. Think about this for a second. Imagine playing this game and you're able to avoid the collision at the game's outset. So instead of everything that happens, you keep driving to St. Louis, and you play out a scenario where you attempt to either save or destroy the relationship between Michelle and Vince. That becomes the game's whole focus. Meanwhile, the whole hostage situation and everything that happens with that is still in the game's files, but you don't uncover any of it on your first playthrough, only to be shocked on how drastic things can be on a second run. Create a few massive branch points like this, and all of a sudden you have a completely different beast, one that takes this game's structure and evolves it to the next logical step. With how it is now, As Dusk Falls tells an interesting story, but it's one that doesn't tread new waters or push the genre forward. This is doubly disappointing when you consider how antiquated the gameplay feels when compared to a title like Life is Strange or even older Telltale games from 10 years ago. In As Dusk Falls, there's really only 3 ways to interact with the game: choices, quick time events, and these brief environmental exploration scenes where you don't even get to move the character. This helps in keeping the cinema-like story moving forward and well-paced, but it leaves the player often feeling like they aren't doing anything for minutes at a time. It never bored me during my first playthrough because of mostly well-written characters with believable personalities and backgrounds and interesting plot beats, but on the second run, seeing those same beats over again took its toll on my interest. Regression from the slow and steady growth this genre has shown is unfortunately the norm for As Dusk Falls. It was especially disappointing to see that most of the QuickTime events don't necessarily impact the outcome of any individual moment, no matter how tense they may seem. For instance, I tripped up after running from police fire, yet there was no consequence for this. Vince made it just fine to his destination in the same way he would have if I did it correctly. Or there's this scene where I messed up the QTE for cutting wood as J, which has no impact or bearing on the story. Nothing happens, nothing's even said about it. The result is that subsequent playthroughs morph your perception of these QTEs. They go from being important tests of your reaction with perceived deadly consequences to being window dressing just to keep the player's hands on the controller through action sequences. The only time they seem to draw real consequence is when you fail repeatedly at them, something that most players won't do unless they're actively trying to. Therefore, this pillar of gameplay is weak, and the other two aren't impressive mechanically either. Appropriate for this style of game, but not necessarily investing the player with any of its systems. The values system warrants mention as well, but not really for the right reasons. Basically, every decision you make in the game is tracked and assigned a trait, such as brave, or rash, or personable, or whatever. At the end of each chapter, the game shows you a very boring screen displaying your 3 traits based on your playstyle. It's such a robotic and cold way of rewarding or demonizing the player according to the decisions they made while playing. It feels strange to even include a system like this given the dark subject matter, especially when it contributes so little to the overall experience. Thankfully though, players are permitted to replay chapters from previously unlocked checkpoints, which will save time for anyone wanting to play things out differently or to go achievement hunting. Switching gears now, and anyone who's already played this title is probably surprised that this next point of discussion wasn't raised earlier, but yes, this game's animation style is going to be very divisive. There isn't a whole lot of character movement, as instead freeze frames with different expressions and reactions are used for portrayal. This puts extra emphasis on the voice acting, but it does make for quite a boring watching experience given the little movement. The character expressions in of themselves are enough to convey meaning and emotion, but not much more than that. Subtle face movements we've seen in other titles recently just isn't on the table in As Dusk Falls, given the art direction that they took. It's going to be off-putting at the start no matter what. Some players will adapt and learn to be okay with it, while others are going to find it jarring for the entire experience. I was in the latter. I was okay with it after a while, but at first I was like, what the hell is this? Meanwhile, items in the environment can move freely at times, but their 3D nature often clashes with the flatness of the main art style. The result is a visual hodgepodge that leads to certain scenes feeling disjointed. This is especially true when you see doors open on their own since the characters don't move freely. It's really awkward. Also, there's these shots of a forest late in the game and they look really suspect. It wasn't completely terrible, but it certainly was not ideal. I will give them props for the sound work, as there are many audio cues scattered throughout the game that helps build the environment despite the freeze frames. This included things like the sound of lighters being fired up, gunshots going off, or even gasps to express character shock. When it comes to presentation, overall, it was fine, but it's certainly going to be a turn-off for many players. There's no doubt in my mind on that one. So what are we left with then? Well, we have a very competent point-and-click adventure game with a gripping and dark story that touches on many uncomfortable but all too real themes. It's one that affords you the opportunity to see how you might react in a dangerous situation without all the real-world fallout that comes with it. It holds up tremendously well on a first playthrough, but the inherent promise of building your own narrative through choice is somewhat soured on subsequent runs. A very gripping first playthrough is followed up by an illusion-shattering second one that sees you being forced down mostly the same pathway. It feels like just another game within this Telltale-like subgenre, and ultimately, there's nothing wrong with that, but there's very little exciting about it either. I do really like this style of game, and I'm desperately ready to see an evolution in its design. It feels more and more necessary after each release. Meanwhile, a divisive art direction and truly underwhelming set of mechanics makes the experience feel extra shallow and hard to get on board with. But it's a game I recommend sticking with if you're looking for something that tackles some of the darker sides of humanity. But when it's over, I'd advise any player to just turn the console off, satisfied with the story they experienced, and await the inevitable DLC or sequel. Just stop after one run. Let that be the curtain falling, just like the Dusk. Thanks for watching. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed this look at Xbox's latest with As Dusk Falls. If you did, consider checking out some of my other Xbox reviews, including looks at Tunic, TMNT Shredder's Revenge, and a franchise analysis of Halo. If you're new, go ahead and join our Discord channel, the Discord of NopNapNarp. You can find the link below. And you should also follow me on Twitter at NopNapNarp to keep up with the latest video news. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing for more, follow my socials, and as always, have a nice day, and take care.